Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me pleasure to speak here. Always a bit daunting to be sandwiched between a Research Council speaker who's talking about figures like 450 million and a Birmingham speaker who's going to be talking about many tens of millions or even hundreds of millions as well. Because in a sense, it's the problem of being a district council that is one of the things that has driven us to do what I'm going to talk about. Really to test the degree to which it's possible to do some joining up in these smaller organisations. And in a nutshell, the problem of being a district council or a borough council is actually one of critical mass and size. And there were speakers earlier on that talked about really the difficulties of trying to get enough specialism and critical mass in a small organisation that isn't just wasteful. And then on top of that, we've got the problems that are faced by all councils, really, about the financial meltdown. And yet we've still got to handle those fixed costs. And as the slide says, with no 7th Cavalry ahead of us. Years gone by, there was a tendency for councils to be able to expect more resources if they hit particular problems, but there's no question that that's not the case now. In Ada and Worthing, the sort of origins of the partnership partly came from being neighbours, partly from both struggling with those financial challenges that I've already referred to. A few early attempts to try and do something jointly, things that had taken far too long to move forwards because, well, we didn't really need to try that hard, I suppose. So those early attempts at partnership and that sort of basic context was what I call the combustible material, the petrol-air mixture. And then the spark that triggered it off was the departure from Worthing, as it happened, of one of the chief executive, and then I was asked to take on an interim role. And from that moment on, really, it was clear that we were going to start moving on a little bit more quickly, because once we started sitting around the same management table, there was some fairly obvious additional momentum and potential that came from what we were doing. This slide summarises the story, the stage we've reached. If you look at the bottom left there, many relationships start with a kiss. Ours started with a depot, which is less romantic but probably far more practical. It very rapidly moved on to saying, well, look, if we've got a shared depot, why don't we maintain the vehicles collectively? Why don't we buy new vehicles? Why? Because if they're wearing out at the same rate, we might as well look at a joint procurement process. Once you've done that, or you've thought about that, you've then got to think about the specification for the vehicles. The specification means you have to ask the public on what refuse collection system you want. More people turned out on the refuse collection consultation than voted that year. Hey, we know something about what determines our reputation from that. We very rapidly moved on, even looked at merging for a very brief period, but very much a very complex and drawn-out process. So let's not bother with that. But could we go for a joint officer structure and management team? HR, finance, you can read the slide as well as I can. And we're right through all of these joined-up services now, and we're still just finishing off some of the service reviews and the transformation activities that take that down below the management levels into the business processes and the actual services themselves. Just make a note of this band along here. Simultaneous executive meetings, great title, I'll explain it in a minute, and the Joint Strategic Committee. And just reflect on that when I start talking shortly about governance, because that's also a theme that's come up already. What's it achieved? 2 chief execs down to 1, 4 directors down to 2, 17 heads of service down to 9 when we get to the week after next. Not big figures by some of the other indicators that we've heard from other organisations, but a couple of million so far, and we've already programmed in, as it rolls forwards, over £6 million over the next couple of years. Those are big figures for district and borough councils. They are big figures, and they're not to be underestimated. And it has transformed the way that each of the councils has been able to manage their budgets. Ada has never felt more comfortable in setting its budget than it has this year. And when you think of the climate around us, that is quite remarkable. This is a critical slide, and it is about the governance thing. The real leadership must be engaged, not the backbenchers sent off to some sort of distant partnership committee that then comes back and says, we're going to join up. And the leader says, you've what? Because that ownership has to be there. So the real leadership needs purposeful contact with the partner organisations. Officers and members need to function in what I call the shared arena, and that governance and the frequency of that meeting and the purpose of that meeting gathers a momentum and a trust that leads through into delivery of partnership arrangements. And if there's one word that sums up why we've moved this on, it is probably the governance word, and that really mustn't be underestimated. And then we come back to this snappy little phrase, simultaneous executive meetings. And the thing that I think got us to where we've got was this brilliant idea in the early days of having the Ada cabinet sitting together with the Worthing cabinet in the same room at the same time with the host chairing. Now, the cabinet meetings were actually separate meetings, but they were taking place at the same time with the same papers. The visiting Martian would have observed a single meeting until the very end when the chairman said, and do the Ada cabinet agree with the recommendations? Yes, no, whatever. And do the Worthing cabinet agree, disagree with the recommendations? Now that sounds like a bizarre thing to do, but just think about the alternative where one council takes a decision and then has to wait for 4 days or a week for the other council to take the same decision. We all know that things happen between one and another, and this solved that problem, and it built up that tradition of discussing across that divide. So really helpful stuff. It still leaves some of the separate decisions around the council meetings, the statutory roles, the budget, the elections and so on. And that has gathered momentum over the years. We started off with just the depot at around £500,000 a year in the early years, and over the years it's progressed until the budget we've just agreed for next year, the joint budget for next year, is £24 million. That is big money for two councils whose net budgets are 12 and 16. That's a gross figure, of course, so it's not quite comparable. But as those two things go over each other, as the two functions of Ada and Worthing become into this sort of shared bit, the governance and the decisions of the joint business becomes more significant than the declining bits of separate business. And it's a fascinating process to be part of. We need to manage in the shared arena. This dialogue between members and officers is not black and white. It's not something that is on or off. There is this managed area in the middle. I call it managing grey, if people want to talk about it like that. Because we've just got to get used, as officers and members, at having that, well, what if type discussion in the middle, and not being drawn into some notion where officers are stepping into the political arena and helping them win elections, or equally that members are stepping into the officer arena and telling us which paper clips to buy. And it's really important to get that zone of discussion right. So that's a sort of elaboration on the governance thing, if you like. And then I suppose one of the things that is also a very tricky area in these sorts of activities is when the sovereignty thing comes into play. Well, we still want to be separate. We still want to be Ada or we want to be Worthing. We don't want to be gobbled up or lost in the other partner. So I've defined this as something that we might call the separate but together trick. And it can be done, and I think we've achieved that really by having this notion that the delivery mechanisms of the officer structure and the joint services, and not just Ada Worthing partnerships, partnership with Horsham and Mid Sussex, with West Sussex County Council and so on, but you still leave the definition of those separate authorities there for the purposes of local representation, democracy and overall governance. So that separate but together trick comes from the simultaneous executive meetings, the freedom to take the decisions, but trying all the time to talk about the benefits, really, of doing things collectively rather than separately. And in exactly the same way as been described before, taking money out of your fixed costs and your back office costs to protect, preserve or enhance frontline services. And in the end, that's something that customers and politicians need to sign up to. In some ways, these sorts of areas might be described as the dark arts. You know, they are actually about managing relationships, about trying to make a win-win situation out of something that could easily fall into something rather more damaging.